Hey creeps, Cameron here. I read almost 60 books in 2023, and I'm here to talk about my top 10. Overall, it was a pretty great year. For one, I was promoted at work to librarian, so I am now a bookmobile librarian. I've also made a lot of videos here on YouTube this year, and while the channel has done reasonably well, what I'm mostly proud of is the fact that I finally released my very first novel, which is a follow-up to my short story collection. I released this year. This is the hardcover edition. It's also available in paperback and ebook, and it's been amazing to see the response to this and to see this making it onto other readers' top 10 lists of the year. That's a wonderful thing. I love reading and seeing the reviews and reactions of people who have read this and have either been surprised by the brutality or in some cases has made them cry at the end, which is very important to me. You're probably thinking it's important to you to make people cry. As an author in kind of an apathetic world, the important thing to me is to appeal to other people's empathy, to show them that it's okay to feel anything besides happiness. It's okay to cry. It's okay to care. It's okay to love, and that it's extremely important to show that love, because what is life other than an opportunity to do just that? That's one of the many points I was trying to make with this book. Yes, it is a throwback to Point Horror and Fear Street and Christopher Pike, but more than anything, I poured my heart and soul into this book, and I'm glad that people are seeing that when they read it. I'm just so glad and grateful to everybody who has read this and reviewed it on Goodreads and Amazon and YouTube and on Instagram. It means the world to me, so thank you everybody. And if you've not read it, if you've not bought it, links are going to be down below. All right, now let's get into my top 10 of the year. I did cheat slightly in a couple of parts, which you'll see. First off, here we have Frankie Graves Part 1 and Frankie Graves Part 2, both by Cameron Roubique, which if you line the books up like so, they make a single image, which I think is so cool. The artwork, of course, is by Cameron Roubique, who is the author of these books. He does the artwork for all of his books. He also does the artwork for my books, of course, because, I mean, you can kind of tell. So Cameron Roubique is a friend of mine, just a disclaimer, but I will say I was a fan of his writing before we became friends. I found out about his books, started reading them, loved them, reviewed them, and then over the years we've talked a lot and have become friends, and we've collaborated, obviously, but it doesn't change the fact that I am still very much a big fan of his work, and to think that I am a friend of his is really crazy to me. And this, Frankie Graves Part 1 and Part 2, it is very much one continuing story, just split into two parts, so it does feel very much like one single book. Part 1 follows Frankie Graves, who is a teenage greaser in the 50s. His father, veteran, sadly took his own life, and now he is sent to live with his grandma, and there is something wrong with his grandma. She is messed up, she is manipulative, and she might have some kind of supernatural abilities. Then there's a twist at the end of this, and you pick up from the 50s into the 80s with Part 2. So this one picks up in 1981, so it's 25 years later, and all the characters from this book are now entering their middle age, and they've got kids of their own. Obviously, I don't want to spoil much about what transpires. It's really the origin stories of a slasher killer, and this is actually a lot darker than a lot of Roubique's other books. His other books are more like 80s slashers. They're fun and campy. They do have a lot of heart, and they have good characters and some emotion, but they rarely get quite as dark as Frankie Graves gets, and that's what I loved about this book. And I cannot wait to read the next book Cameron Roubique writes. So this is like 7 books, I think, so far, and I'm ready for his 8th. Mixing it up a little bit, we have a slightly older book here. This is from 2001, and it is called The Diary of Ellen Rimbauer, My Life at Rose Red. Now, if you are a millennial or older, you probably remember Stephen King's Rose Red, which was a miniseries that came on ABC back in like 2001, the same time this book came out, and I was obsessed with it. So Rose Red basically follows a group of paranormal investigators that are going into this house called Rose Red, which is basically the Winchester Mystery House, just Stephen King's version of it. They're investigating the Rimbauer family and the hauntings of this house that seems to just grow on its own. It's just such a fun, balls to the wall haunted house miniseries. And I rewatched it for like probably the 20th time earlier last year. And then I immediately picked up The Diary of Ellen Rimbauer, which is a tie-in to the miniseries. This isn't an actual diary, though it is formatted like one. And this actually isn't even written by Stephen King. It's written by Ridley Pearson. What Ridley Pearson did was take the history of Rose Red as imagined by Stephen King and expanded it into a full-length novel written in the form of Ellen Rimbauer's diary. This was later adapted into another TV movie called The Diary of Ellen Rimbauer, which is decent. It's not too bad, but I do think the book is a lot better. I have been wanting to read this for years. In fact, I bought this when it came out, finally got around to reading it, and oh my God, I ate this book up like it was rich, dark chocolate. And it is dark, it is disturbing, it is creepy, but it's also so grounded in realism that it really adds to the mystery and gives it that kind of urban legend feel. You could easily read this book and think, well, Ellen Rimbauer has every reason to have gone mad in this house, and maybe that's all it is that she's descended into madness. But obviously, if you've seen Rose Red, the miniseries, you know that that's not just it. This is a lot more than just ghosts and bumps in the night, though, because the core of the story, you have Ellen Rimbauer, who is a very young bride. She just married John Rimbauer, who is this multi-millionaire, at least in terms of the 1800s. He just built her this giant house called Rose Red, and he's given her the freedom to design the house and make it into her own, which I really think he did as more of a distraction to her, because John Rimbauer is not faithful by any means, and Ellen Rimbauer knows it. She's very observative, and she knows exactly what he's up to. The book centers a lot on their relationship, and it is like one of the most disturbing, dysfunctional relationships I think I've ever read. For one, he is disgusting and a sleazebag, and of course he uses that against Ellen Rimbauer, but Ellen also uses that to her advantage. She's able to manipulate him in ways with her sexuality because she knows that that's his weakness. I'm not going to say that this is a steamy, sexy book, because it really isn't at the end of the day, but there is a lot of sex in this book. So if you don't like that, maybe steer clear of this one. I read some reviews on Goodreads from people who weren't too happy about that, but this isn't an erotic book. There's nothing titillating about this. It's really very disturbing. So just keep that in mind. I just found this to be so engaging and just gripping and addictive. I couldn't put it down. If you like haunted house stories, if you like Rose Red, I say give it a go. I gave it 5 stars. Next up is another haunted house story, but this one is very unique and very different. It is Beloved by Toni Morrison. I was familiar with Toni Morrison's picture books because I work on a children's bookmobile, so I've read a lot of picture books, but I had never read any of her novels, and I had never read Beloved. I don't know how, but I've fixed that, and I finally read Beloved by Toni Morrison. And wow. This follows a woman named Setha, who is a freed slave woman. But even though she escaped slavery, she is haunted and plagued by it every day. It's not something that goes away. So this is taking place several years after the Civil War, and she is now, middle-aged, upper middle age, and she's got a few kids of her own. But all of her neighbors treat her and her children very differently, because not only is their house haunted by a ruthless, and I mean ruthless, spirit, but after being freed and having some children of her own, she made an irreversible mistake. It's literally haunted her every waking moment. But then a mysterious young woman comes to town who claims that her name is Beloved. This book is haunting. It's obviously very upsetting. It has to do a lot with slavery, so it's gonna make you cry. It's gonna make you feel things. It's one that you need to take very, very slowly while you're reading it, because for one, Toni Morrison is a beautiful writer and is also not a conventional writer. She just plops you in and you're just like, who the hell is Baby Suggs? Who is that? She doesn't tell you. You have to read like a quarter of the book to be like, oh, this is this person. And then it starts to become clear. I did mark a section of this book that I feel describes the house as a person very much the way that Shirley Jackson does with The Haunting of Hill House. I think these two are like the best passages at describing a house, and not just a house, but a haunted house that is itself a character in the story. So this section is from Denver, who is Setha's daughter, and it says, "Shivering, Denver approached the house, regarding it as she always did, as a person rather than a structure, a person that wept, sighed, trembled, and fell into fits. Her steps and her gaze were the cautious ones of a child approaching a nervous, idle relative, someone dependent but proud." Toni Morrison, am I going to be reading more of her books? Yes, I want to read absolutely everything she's written. I just thought this was beautiful, 5 stars. Taking a few steps down from the complex writing of Pulitzer Prize-winning Toni Morrison, we've got a middle grade book. This is Death in Douglas by J.W. Oker, who's one of my favorite writers. He is mostly known for writing tons of spooky non-fiction books, like he did A Season with the Witch, which is one of my favorite books about Salem, Massachusetts. He's written a couple of great books for Quirk, like a book about cryptids and cursed objects, but he's also written quite a few middle grade books, and Death in Douglas is, I think, one of his very best. This follows a young boy named Douglas who is being raised in a funeral home. It feels a little bit like a children's version of 6 Feet Under, you could say. Not only that, but it also goes a little bit darker in that there is a serial killer in town. It actually gets quite intense, especially at the end of the book, where I was like, damn, I'm holding my breath. I need to breathe. And even though this is a middle grade book, it does not talk down to children, which I think is a wonderful thing. Therefore, it's perfectly easy to relate to this book as an adult. The conversations about death here are completely unfiltered. So if you have a child or you know a child who may not have been really exposed to death yet or doesn't understand it, maybe recommend this book to them, because I think it has a lot to say and it does so in a very digestible way. Suckerville by Chris Sorensen. Chris Sorensen is one of my favorite authors. I have read his Messy Man trilogy and loved it. That's another great haunted house book series. I'm going to need to do a haunted house video very soon, obviously. But while the Messy Man trilogy was a lot more existential and heartfelt and sad and dark, Suckerville is a B monster movie that is just nothing but a crazy good time. Basically, these sucker parasites are latching on to people and turning them into mindless zombies. That's really all you need to know. I mean, people are locked up in a tavern trying to fight against these parasitic zombies. That's really my only complaint about this book, is that it is more of a zombie book and I'm not really into zombies so much. But somehow it didn't really take away my enjoyment of the book. I had a lot of fun with this. It's nice to pick up a crazy book like this and kind of just turn my brain off and enjoy it for exactly what it is, and that's just a crazy good time. So if you like your books to be a little gory and pulpy and trashy, Suckerville by Chris Sorensen. It'll have you set up. I also dug into some nonfiction last year and read There Is Something Strange About My Brain by R.L. Stine. This is writing horror for kids. So basically, it's a little bit like On Writing by Stephen King, just R.L. Stine's version of that. As a huge, massive R.L. Stine fan, I was so excited to read this. Of course, I know a lot about R.L. Stine because I've seen numerous interviews with him. I have read It Came From Ohio, which is his autobiography, so I do know quite a lot about the man himself. But this is a little bit different in that it is his masterclass that he taught, but kind of put into book form. So there are some tips and tricks here that are exclusive to his masterclass that I was really excited to read in a more affordable way, because his masterclass is a little bit pricey. So not only does he give a lot of helpful tips, but there are a lot of like hands-on exercises. In fact, this book isn't perfect. I do have some complaints about it. Half the book is just like prompts. It's basically a journal or a Fear Street midnight diary. But of the writing that is in here, it's very strong, and I loved getting to read some of his personal life experiences and opinions about writing. For instance, he talks about writing a book with his wife, Jane Stine, and how they both approach writing in very different ways. He likes to write from beginning to end. She likes to kind of just go all over the place and write what she is feeling at the moment. And that just wasn't clashing for them. And I guess it ended up with her locking him in a closet and leaving the house. And then she eventually had to come back and let him out, which I don't know if that actually happened or if that's just exaggerated, because R.L. Stine is very funny and he has a lot of wit, which shines in this book. And another highlight of some of R.L. Stine's humor is that there's a part earlier on where he's talking about when he was a kid and there used to be this deep freezer in his parents' basement, and he was so afraid to go down into the basement because he was worried he would see a dead body in this deep freezer. Well, anyway, one day his dad asks him to go get some meat out of the deep freezer. So he walks down those basement stairs and he creeps toward the deep freezer and he opens it up, and inside is a dead body. And then he's like, "Did you believe me? You shouldn't have. I'm a writer." Now, like I said, there are complaints I have about this book, like the fact that half of it is basically a journal. Then there are also a lot of errors. And I mean, it goes beyond just a typo here or there. It is like some serious formatting errors, a lot of very clunky sentences. The word as is spelled with 2 S's, so it says ass at one point. That's obviously not supposed to be there. So this is an independently published book, which is strange because it's an R.L. Stine book. An independent publisher reached out to him and made an arrangement to publish this book, and they just didn't do as good a job as they probably should have, or they shouldn't have rushed it as much as they did. Hopefully the second printing will fix a lot of those errors. Regardless though, I had so much fun reading this book, and I do recommend it to any R.L. Stine fans out there. This is a must read. Speaking of R.L. Stine, in 2023, I continued my Fear Street reading vlogs with the Cheerleaders trilogy. So this is True Evil, which combines all 3 of the original Cheerleaders books. I do have the original copies on my shelves. They're just a little bit harder to get to. So I pulled this off. This is just a bind up omnibus edition that you can get right now. It's in print. I did a big Fear Street reading vlog all about these books. So I'm gonna post it up here somewhere so you can go and watch it. I go into a lot of detail about the Cheerleaders books, and I had so much fun making that video and editing it. I put a lot of video clips in there and some visual gags, which you'll see if you watch the video. I tried to make it fun and entertaining. The video is still a little bit underseen though, so if you want to go and watch it, I would definitely appreciate it. But yeah, Cheerleaders, Fear Street, one of my favorite book series. Rereading this trilogy was like meeting up with an old friend. It's so good and so cozy, and I can't wait to continue on and read more Fear Street books. Speaking of cozy, Ruby Jean Jensen is an author I like to go to whenever I need just a simple, spooky, fun, good time, and Mama was definitely that. This book follows a family that just suffered an extreme loss. So the mother packs up her kids and they move to her old childhood home to kind of start anew. However, there are some evil toys up in the attic, and the youngest starts to play with these toys and becomes kind of manipulated by them. At the time reading this book, I was just in the mood for some mindless, good horror fun, and this was perfect. Not only is it cozy and familiar, but it's also very spooky. There are points of this book where I was like, oh, geez. It's very surprisingly scary. Like there's a scene where the youngest son looks up at the house from outside and he sees the face of like a demon looking out at him. And I got chills all over my body. And I just did just now. It's a really creepy image. Kind of reminded me of like Amityville in a way, with the pig-faced demon. Mama by Ruby Jean Jensen. It's good. I liked it. Next up, we have more of a mystery thriller, which I actually started the year out with. So started the year off to a good start. Throughout the year, I wasn't sure if this was going to remain on my top 10, but it did. And that is All Around the Town by Mary Higgins Clark. I actually don't have a physical copy with me right now, so I'm just putting a picture up there. Of course, I have always heard about Mary Higgins Clark over the years. I know that there are people who are hardcore fans of hers, and this one in particular was recommended to me. So I picked it up thinking it was going to be more of like one of those granny mysteries, you know, like one of those best-selling grocery store books that tend to appeal to older people. I was pleasantly surprised that this book is actually insanely dark and disturbing. So this, I believe, was published in the early 90s. It follows a girl who was actually kidnapped as a child, just plucked right out of the front yard. She was held hostage in a basement by a couple, and then she was eventually released by them. But because of the traumatic experience, she had extreme amnesia. She barely remembers what happened, and it only comes back to her kind of in flashes. There are certain events that tend to trigger her trauma, and she begins to exhibit signs of multiple personality disorder. I do recommend All Around the Town, and I am so excited to check out more books by Mary Higgins Clark, especially her earlier books around this time period, because I have heard that her books get really repetitive and formulaic as they go, which I think happens to a lot of those writers. But of all the good things I've heard about her work, it's always been about those early books, like those first 10 or 15 books. And last but not least, we're going to go from a book like Beloved by Toni Morrison, and we're going to end with The Woods Are Dark by Richard Laymon, one of the trashiest authors of all time. Pulitzer Prize, this is not. So Richard Laymon, of course, is a very controversial author. He's not going to be for everybody. I don't think he should be for everybody, but The Woods Are Dark is one of his most recognizable books. It follows just a group of people who kind of are in the wrong place at the wrong time. They end up getting caught in the woods, trapped with these cannibalistic beings, these monsters, and it is just a wall-to-wall horror fest, and that is it. There's barely plot here. It's just people stuck in the woods trying to fight off these cannibals. It is trashy, it's gory, it is weird and gross and fun and just, I don't even know. It's Richard Laymon. What do you expect? Even though it gets really dark and messed up, it's also just so over the top and kind of goofy that it's hard to take it seriously. At the end of the day, it's just a non-stop roller coaster ride, and I loved it. And I'm actually going to be reading a lot more Richard Laymon this year because I've really not read too many of his books. Kelsey from Slime and Slashers is doing the Year of Laymon, so I'm going to be reading a lot of Laymon this year, probably one every month. But this one is one that I recommend starting with. So there you go. Top 10 books of 2023. It was a great reading year, and I think 2024 is going to be even better. Let me know what your favorite books were from 2023, and I will catch you guys very soon in another episode of Library Macabre. Later, creeps.